6. Marlowe visits Jim. The coast of Patusan is straight and dark on a misty sea. When I arrived there, nearly 2 years later, I could see blue mountain tops beyond the thick green jungle. Fortunately, the river was open then, and our ship stopped at the fishing village called Batu Kring, at the mouth of the river. We needed to take on board a native to guide our little ship up the river to the trading post at Patusan. The man who agreed to come with us was the chief or headman of the village. He talked confidently to me, only the second white man he had ever seen, and most of his talk was about the first white man he had ever seen. He called him Tuan Jim, and spoke of him with great respect. I thought of Jim's last words to me, "You shall hear of me." It was perfectly true. I was hearing of him. At first, the headman told me, the natives had been very frightened of the lonely, white-uniformed figure who had arrived so unexpectedly, and who gave them orders. He wanted them to take him by boat to the trading post immediately. They were afraid Raja Alang would be angry with them if they obeyed the stranger, but they were in greater fear of the white man's anger. After a lot of whispering among themselves, they decided that 3 of them would take Jim up the river by canoe. That is how Jim entered the country where he became known and respected, from the blue mountains beyond the jungle to the white tops of the waves on the coast. Behind him were the waves of the sea, endlessly rising and sinking, and ahead of him were the immovable forests, reaching up towards the sunshine, but as dark and shadowy as life itself. And his opportunity sat waiting by his side, like an Eastern bride hiding her lovely face from her future husband. But Jim told me later that he had never in his life felt so miserable and tired as in that canoe. He sat there with his back straight and the sun beating down on his head, holding the gun I had given him. He felt almost sick with worry and the heat. As soon as the canoe reached the trading post, the 3 boatmen jumped out and ran off into the trees. Jim saw a stockade with high wooden posts on his left, and some native houses further away. He jumped out too, and at first seemed to be alone. But then a gate in the stockade was thrown open, and a lot of Malays ran towards him. At the same time, a boat full of men with weapons appeared on the river, so that he could not escape in the now empty canoe. There was no way out. The boatman had handed him over to the Raja's men. Luckily, there was no ammunition in my gun, Jim told me, so I didn't try to kill anyone, and they didn't hurt me. I just asked them what they wanted. They didn't know what to say. Finally, a servant ran up to say the Raja wanted to see me. "All right," I said, "I want to see him too," and I simply walked in through the gate. And do you know the best thing about it? I'll tell you. It was lucky for them that they didn't kill me. He was speaking to me in front of his house on that first evening of my visit, after we had watched the moon move away over the hills like a soul rising from a dead body. Moonlight is confusing and mysterious. It makes real things look shadowy, and shadows look real. But Jim, by my side, seemed very strong. Not even moonlight could make him look shadowy to me. Perhaps, indeed, nothing could touch him, since he had survived his fight with evil. All was silent. All was still in this lost corner of the world. The silvery grey houses crowding along the wide, shining river seemed like a line of ghostly animals pushing forward to drink from the lifeless water. Here and there a warm red light shone through the thin house walls where human beings ate and talked and rested. "You know," Jim said to me, "I often watch those little lights go out one by one. I love seeing people go to sleep under my eyes, safe and happy, with no fears for tomorrow. Peaceful here, isn't it? Ask any man, woman or child here if they trust me." He paused and spoke with deep meaning. "Well, now I know I'm all right anyway." "So you found that out at last," I replied. "I was always sure you were." "Were you?" He touched my arm lightly. "Well then, you were right. My God, just think what it means to me. How could I ever leave here? And after what you tell me of Mr. Stein's offer, leaving? It will be harder than dying. No, don't laugh, but I must feel, every day, every time I open my eyes, that I am trusted. That nobody can say, you know, 'Leave? Where would I go? Why? For what?'" I had told him, indeed, it was the main reason for my visit, that Stein wanted to hand over the whole trading post, with everything it contained, to Jim. At first, Jim had refused to accept this generous offer, but I had made him realize that he had earned it. "Stein is only giving you what you have made for yourself," I had told him. And Jim had to give in, because all his successes, the trust, the fame, the love, all these things, which had given him control over his life and fate, had also made him a prisoner. He looked with an owner's eye at the land and its people, but it was they who owned him, to the last breath in his body. The trust and respect of these people was something to be proud of. I, too, was proud for him. It was certainly wonderful. He had shown he was a brave, intelligent, well-organized leader of men. He clearly felt deeply and seriously about his work in Patusan, the work that had proved to him that he was all right. That is why he seemed to love the land and the people with a kind of wild selfishness. While I was in Patusan, Jim took me to visit the Rajah. "This is where I was prisoner for 3 days when I arrived," he whispered to me as we walked slowly through a silent and respectful crowd. "Dirty place, isn't it? And they only gave me a small plate of rice and a bit of fried fish to eat. They took my gun away, of course, but they didn't lock me up. I was able to walk around inside the stockade." At that moment we arrived in front of the Rajah, and I noticed how Jim changed his way of speaking at once. His manner was calm and polite, and he spoke slowly and seriously, giving a lot of thought to his words. This had just the right effect on the evil old Rajah, who was clearly afraid of Jim, but still respected and trusted him. Although their conversation was difficult for me to follow, I understood that Jim was acting as a kind of judge, and telling the Rajah the difference between right and wrong. Some poor villagers had been robbed while on their way to trade at Doramin's house, and it was clear that everyone knew the Rajah's men were responsible for this robbery. But to the Rajah, Doramin was a hated enemy, and the Rajah cried out suddenly, "It's Doramin who is a thief!" His weak old body shook with anger, and all around us his family and servants stared, their mouths open. Then Jim began to speak. "Nobody," he said calmly, should prevent any man from getting his food and his children's food honestly. Nobody should ever steal. There was a great stillness in the room. Finally, the old Rajah looked up, shaking his head tiredly, and said, "You hear, my people? No more of these little games." One of his servants came forward to offer us 2 cups of coffee. "You needn't drink," Jim whispered quickly to me. I didn't understand what he meant at first, but just watched him as he drank. Then I realized and felt extremely annoyed. "Why the hell do you put me in danger like this?" I whispered back to him, smiling pleasantly all the time. I drank the coffee, of course. I couldn't avoid doing that, and we left soon afterwards. "I'm very sorry about that," said Jim quietly to me as we walked back to our boat. "I really don't think he would try to poison us. Personally, I never think about it. You see, if I want to do any good here, I have to show I don't care about the danger. Many people trust me to do that, for them." "But anyone can see he's afraid of you," I said crossly, all the time watching for the first sign of stomach pain. "That's just it. He's probably afraid of me because I'm not afraid of his coffee." He pointed to part of the stockade, where the tops of several posts were broken. "Look, that's where I jumped over, on my 3rd day as a prisoner. The Rajah and his advisers had spent all the time since my arrival trying to decide what to do with me, and I had just been waiting for something to happen. But suddenly I realized what extreme danger I was in, so I just ran at the stockade and flew over it like a bird. I picked myself up on the other side and ran as fast as I could towards the village houses, about 400 meters away. Behind me I could hear shouting as the Rajah's men started to follow me. Ahead of me was a creek. I jumped across it and landed in very soft, wet mud. I couldn't move my legs at all, and lay there trying desperately to pull myself out with my arms. The mud came right up to my chin, and as I dug wildly, I thought I was burying myself even deeper. I was becoming exhausted, but I made one last great attempt, and at last felt myself creeping weakly out of the mud on the other side of the creek. Think of me, muddy and alone in that terrible place, with no friends or anyone to help me. I ran through the village. Women and children ran screaming from me. Men stood still, staring at me in horror. I don't suppose I looked at all like a human being. Finally, I turned a corner and fell into the arms of several surprised-looking men. I just had breath to cry, "Doramin!" They carried me to Doramin's house, which was inside its own stockade, and put me down in front of a large, important-looking man sitting in a chair. Somewhere in my muddy clothes I managed to find Stein's silver ring. Everyone was shouting excitedly and running here and there. I could hear shots in the distance from the Rajah's men, but here I was safe. Doramin's people were closing the heavy gates of the stockade and giving me water to drink. Doramin's wife took care of me. She was very kind to me. About 60 families in Patusan considered Doramin their chief. His men frequently had fights with the Rajah's people, mostly about trading. The problem was that the Rajah thought he alone should trade in Patusan. He became wild with anger when he discovered anyone else buying or selling. He was a cruel, evil, and cowardly man who had made a habit of robbing and killing Doramin's people, until Jim came. There was a third leader in Patusan, an Arab half-caste called Sheriff Ali, who had persuaded some of the natives to join him. They lived high up on the top of one of the two mountains, and from there often came down at night to steal food and animals, kill people and burn buildings. Parts of the countryside were blackened and empty, and the local people were suffering badly. In this confused situation, none of the three leaders trusted or respected each other, and until Jim's arrival there seemed no way of bringing peace to the country. If you once saw Doramin, you would never forget him. He was much larger than most Malays, with a heavy body dressed in richly coloured clothes, and a big, flat, round head with proud, staring eyes. No one ever heard him raise his voice. He never moved without help. When he walked, two strong young men dressed in white held his elbows. In the afternoons he sat silently by his wife's side, looking out, through an opening in the stockade, at the dark green jungle, the distant purple mountains, and the silver, shining river. This old couple had a son called Dane Waris, a polite, handsome young man of 24 or 5. They loved him deeply, although they never showed it. I liked him as soon as I met him. I realized he was both brave and intelligent, and I believe he trusted and even understood Jim. Dane Waris is the best friend I've ever had, except for you, Jim told me proudly. We fought together, you know, against Sheriff Ali. You see, when I arrived, the Rajah, Doramin, and Sheriff Ali were all afraid of each other. I soon realized what I had to do, but I needed Dane Waris's help. He was the first to believe in me, and he persuaded his father to agree to my plan. Jim's plan. I heard the whole story of it from him during my visit. He had decided that it was necessary to defeat Sheriff Ali and planned to attack his mountain home. Doramin owned several heavy old guns, used in the past for fighting jungle wars. One dark night, Jim arranged for teams of men using ropes to pull these guns right up to the top of one of the mountains. It was difficult, hot work, and all the time Jim and the men were lifting and pulling, old Doramin sat watching silently in his chair. The Malays already believed that Jim was doing the impossible. How could those guns, too heavy for one man to lift, reach the mountain top? This was the beginning of their great respect for Jim. From there, Doramin's men had an excellent view of the other mountain top, where Sheriff Ali and his followers were asleep. As soon as the sun rose, the first shots were fired on Jim's order, and the battle began. Jim, with Dane Waris by his side, led a group up the second hill towards Sheriff Ali's stockade. He knew he had to win this fight. Doramin's people were depending on him. He and Dane Waris were the first to break into the Arab stockade. Close behind them came Tam Itam, Jim's personal servant and a fearless fighter. He was a Malay from the north, a stranger to Patusan, who for a time had been a prisoner of the Rajah. When he escaped, he came to Jim, and ever since had followed him everywhere, like a shadow. The battle was violent but short. The stockade was burnt down, and Sheriff Ali and his men were defeated. Some were dead, but most of them were chased away into the jungle. When this wonderful news reached the village, people were delighted. They ran in and out of their houses, shouting, singing, and laughing excitedly. Of course, Jim was delighted too. He had succeeded in doing what he had promised, and now he could believe in himself again. I can't tell you how completely lonely he appeared to me, but somehow his loneliness added to his greatness. He seemed to be one of those men who can only be measured by their greatness of their fame, and his fame, remember, was the greatest thing for many a day's journey around, even beyond the jungle. His word was the one truth of every passing day, and reports of his fame travelled far and wide, heard on the lips of whispering men, full of wonder and mystery. No one ever saw Sheriff Ali again, and when some of his men crept back from the jungle later, it was Jim, advised by Dane Warris, who chose a headman from among them. The Rajah was afraid that Jim would attack him too. He could lose his land, his money, his women, his servants, and therefore he behaved very carefully. So Jim found himself in complete control of one of the most dangerous corners of the world. Old Doramin, however, had a secret wish. He wanted to see his son take the Rajah's place one day, and just before I left, he spoke to me about it. "Of course, Tuan Jim knows best," he said, "but if I could only have a promise. I worry about the future of our country. You see, the land is always here, but white men come and go. One day, this white man too will—" "No, no," I replied quickly, without thinking. "He won't go." Doramin looked into my face. "That is good news indeed," he answered calmly. "But why do you say that?" And his wife, a small, thin, motherly woman, asked sadly, "Why did he travel so far away from his home? Has he no family, no old mother who will always remember his face?" I could not answer. Strangely enough, that evening, my last in Patusan, I was asked the same question again. 7. Jim in love and in danger. This brings me to the story of his love. Remember the unspeakably awful Cornelius? I saw him and spoke to him myself, as he crept around Patusan with evil in his heart and lying promises on his lips. How his poor wife had come to marry him is a mystery to me. I do not know, either, what had happened to her daughter's father, who was not Cornelius. The fact remains that she already had her daughter when she married the Portuguese. Bitterly disappointed with his life, he seemed to hate the woman and her child, and behaved very badly to both of them. The two women lived very lonely lives at the trading post, with no other friends or companions. When the older woman died, a short time before Jim's arrival, the daughter was lonelier than ever. Jim decided to leave Doramin's place after only a few days there, and move into the house at the trading post where Cornelius and the girl lived. Although Doramin warned him this would be dangerous, Jim felt it was his duty to take care of Stein's business. At first Cornelius pretended to be delighted that Jim was staying with him, but he soon showed his real character. Jim realized that Cornelius had been stealing from Stein at every opportunity. There seemed to be almost nothing left of the business, and some of the papers were missing. "It was miserable there," Jim told me. "Cornelius was too mean to give me any regular meals. And then I heard the Rajah was planning to murder me. Pleasant, wasn't it?" He added that he didn't know what had made him stay there for 6 weeks, but of course we can guess. He was very sorry for the motherless girl. It appears Cornelius frequently shouted at her, although he was too cowardly to hit her. Call me father, and with respect too," he used to scream into her face. "Your mother was an evil woman, and you're evil as well." The girl usually put her hands over her ears and ran away, while Cornelius chased her, shouting wildly and often throwing dirt at her. But sometimes she used to listen in silence, staring scornfully at him and replying with a poisonous word or two. Jim told me he could not leave the house while the poor girl was so unhappy. His conscience would not let him. But every day he received another message that there were plans to drown, shoot, or poison him, and he realized he was in great danger. He no longer slept well at night. He noticed that Cornelius was acting very strangely, giving hesitating answers to Jim's questions, creeping secretly round the house in the dark, and having mysterious meetings with people at night. One night, however, Jim was woken by the girl. She was holding a burning torch high above his head and was whispering, "Get up! Get up!" He jumped to his feet, and she put his gun into his hand. "Can you fight 4 men?" she asked. He answered politely, "Certainly, whatever you want," and followed her outside. On the veranda he noticed that Cornelius's bed was empty. The girl led him away from the house towards the trading post buildings. She turned and whispered to Jim, "They were going to attack you while you slept." Jim felt miserably disappointed. He did not want to hear any more about these attempts to kill him. He had only come outside with her because he thought she wanted his help. But they walked on together. It was a beautiful night, quite cool, with a soft wind blowing from the river. Remember, my friends, this is a love story I'm telling you now. The girl stopped outside one of the buildings and held her torch up high like a flag. "They're in there, waiting for the sign," she whispered. "But you have been sleeping so restlessly. I watch you every night." "You've been watching me?" Jim felt first surprised, then delighted. But at that moment a movement caught his eye, and he saw a dark figure move quickly past. "Cornelius!" he called in a strong voice. There was a deep silence. "Run! Go to Doramin," the girl said excitedly. "For the moment you are safe. They know you are awake. They know you are big, strong, fearless. But what about tomorrow? Or any other night? How can I always be watching?" Jim was terribly touched by the feeling in her voice. He realized that the only escape from his loneliness was in her. If he went away from her, he told me, it would be the end of everything. So the only thing to do was to enter the building and find his murderers. He moved forward, and the girl, understanding his plan, ran round to the side of the building and put her torch through the open window so that he had enough light to see. Jim threw open the door and went in. From a dark corner a man ran towards him holding a knife. Jim shot him in the head and killed him. 3 more men came forward, holding out their empty hands to show they had no weapons. "Walk outside," Jim ordered. At the door he was joined by the girl, still holding the torch. Her black hair fell to her waist, and her white dress touched the ground as she walked. The 3 men walked in front, followed by Jim and the girl, until they reached the river. "Jump!" shouted Jim, and the men jumped. Jim watched them swim into the distance. He turned to the girl. His heart seemed suddenly to grow too big for his chest, and he was unable to speak. They looked at each other for a long time. Then she threw the burning torch far into the river. The calm, soft starlight came down on them. It was one of those nights that seem made for love. I don't suppose he could express himself very well, but there are moments when our souls need silence more than words. I met the girl, of course, on my visit. She had a child's sensitive face and moved quickly and lightly, like a little bird. Her skin was smooth, and her hair a deep blue-black flowing thickly onto her lovely shoulders. She spoke and understood quite a lot of English, and used to listen carefully to our conversations, keeping her big, clear eyes fastened on our lips. Her love for Jim surrounded him completely. I felt I could almost touch it. I suppose you think I, too, am romantic, but I'm just telling you what I saw. I realized she loved him deeply and jealously, but what she was jealous of I did not know. After all, the land, the people, the forests were on her side, guarding Jim day and night and keeping him prisoner. Even Tamby Tam, ready to die for the Tuan, was proud to guard Jim. And the girl herself, I believe, never went to sleep until Jim and I had separated for the night. More than once I saw her and Jim through the window of my room stand quietly together on the veranda. Two figures very close, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder. He called her Jewel. Pretty, isn't it? A strange name, of course, but it probably explained the surprising story I had heard on my way to Patusan, in a village about 300 kilometers south of there. Local people told me that the mysterious white stranger who had taken control of the area had discovered a very large and valuable jewel. As he was often seen walking with a girl, behaving with great respect and care towards her, it was supposed that she wore the white man's jewel hidden in her dress. It was true that Jim took the girl on evening walks, and that romance had taken hold of him, but the rest of the story was just imagination. He did not hide his jewel. In fact, he was extremely proud of it. I love her dearly, he told me. You see, it's so wonderful when you feel you're needed by someone. And her life was so awful before. She trusts me to take care of her, and I will, you know. I've been here only 2 years now, and I really can't imagine living anywhere else. The thought of the world outside is enough to frighten me because—" and he looked down at his boots, "I haven't forgotten why I came here. Not yet." We walked by the river in silence for a few moments. "Isn't it strange that all these people who would do anything for me will never understand? If you ask them who is brave, who is faithful, who they would trust with their lives, they would say, Tuan Jim. But they can never know the real truth." He paused again. "It doesn't matter. I am almost happy with what I've done, and they believe in me. That's what they've done for me. I shall always remain here." When he left me, I saw the girl's white figure coming towards me. She had clearly been waiting for this opportunity. She wanted something simple but impossible, a promise, an explanation. Because she had grown up in Patusan and knew nothing of the strange world outside, her one great fear was that Jim, who had come from there, would one day return to it. She had watched us closely and listened to all our conversations, afraid perhaps that I was planning to take Jim away from her. and now she spoke to me, desperate to know what her fate would be. I was deeply touched by her helplessness. She was young, beautiful, and very unhappy. "He promised he would never leave me," she whispered, holding her lovely head in her hands. "Why don't you believe him?" I replied. "I certainly won't take him away." "They always leave us," she said, even more quietly. "I don't want to suffer like my mother. She cried bitterly while she was dying. My father also promised never to leave, you know." "Ah, but Jim isn't like that," I said. She was silent. It seemed strange to me. "What has he been telling you?" "I don't know," she cried miserably. "He says there's something he can never forget." "What is it? Tell me. You both remember something. Is it alive? Is it dead? I hate it. Will it come for him? Will he see it in his sleep, perhaps, when he cannot see me, and then leave me? Will it be a sign, a call?" I was deeply moved by her pain. I wanted very much to bring calm to her soul and to say, "Have no fear." But how do you kill fear? Can you shoot a ghost through the heart? Can you cut off its head? I spoke with a heavy heart, with a kind of anger. There is nothing in that unknown world outside, no face, no voice, no one alive or dead, who can take Jim away from you. "He told me that," she answered softly. "But why did you come? You make me afraid. Do you want him?" "I shall never come again," I said bitterly, "and I don't want him. No one wants him. This world you don't know is too big to miss him. And you've got his heart in your hand. You must feel that. You must know that." "Yes, I know that," she whispered, hard and still, like a figure in stone. I was getting excited. I felt I almost had a chance of killing the ghost at last. In the whole world there is no one who will ever need his heart, his head, his hand. From all the millions of people out there, I can tell you that as long as he lives, there will never come a call or a sign for him. Never. Why are you afraid? You know he's strong, faithful, and brave. He is more than that. He has greatness. And the world doesn't want him. It has forgotten him. I stopped. There was a deep silence over Patusan. "Why?" she asked quietly. I felt the ghost escaping, and confused, did not answer. "Why?" she repeated. "Tell me." Suddenly I cried out angrily, "Because he is not good enough." "That is what he said," she replied scornfully. "You lie." "Listen," I cried, "nobody is good enough." She turned away. How could I explain? He had told her, and she had not believed him. Who knows if we both lied or not? But none of that mattered. You see, I had decided that Jim, who was the only one I really cared about, had at last taken control of his fate. He had told me he was almost happy with what he had done. Not many of us can say that. Can any of you here? No, I thought not. So it did not matter who trusted him, who loved him, who hated him. The next morning Jim came with me on the first part of my journey out of Patusan. As our canoe moved fast down the river, the trading post and the houses disappeared behind us. "That man Cornelius hates you," I said, remembering a recent conversation with the Portuguese. He thinks you've stolen everything from him. He could be dangerous. My dear Marlowe, I feel that if I go straight, nothing can touch me. Everything depends on me, and my God, I know I can do it. Cornelius isn't worth worrying about. The air was hot and heavy and smelt of mud. We were silent for a time, knowing we would separate soon. Suddenly the sky seemed to widen. There was a freshness in the air, and at last we were out of the jungle. Ahead of us was the open sea. I breathed deeply. I felt free again. The girl was right. There was a sign, a call from the wider world outside. For me. "This is wonderful!" I cried, then looked at the unfortunate man beside me. He sat with his head bent low on his chest and did not look up, perhaps afraid to see what his romantic conscience had written on the clear sky. I remember the smallest details of that afternoon. We landed on a white beach near the mouth of the river to wait for my ship. 2 natives came to tell Jim that the Rajah's men were stealing their eggs. He told them gently to wait, and they sat down obediently on the ground. "You see, I can't go away," he said to me. "The people here need me now. They would fight amongst themselves if I left. I must stay. I shall be faithful." I remembered Stein's words, "Follow the dream to the end." "And there's Jewel," he went on. "She's everything to me. When shall you and I meet again, I wonder?" "Never, unless you come out," I replied. He didn't seem very surprised. He was quiet for a while. "Goodbye, then," he said after a pause. "Perhaps it's best this way." We shook hands, and I walked to the ship's boat, which by now was waiting for me in shallow water. "Will you go home again soon?" asked Jim, just as I was getting in. "In a year or so, if I'm alive then," I said. The boat started moving away from the beach. Jim, at the water's edge, spoke louder. "Tell them—" he began. I ordered the boatman to stop rowing and waited. "Tell who?" "No, nothing," he said, and waved us away. I did not look at the beach again until I had climbed on board the ship. By that time the sun had gone down and the coast looked very black, but I could still see Jim on the beach. The 2 natives were standing close to him, no doubt telling the White Lord about their miserable, difficult lives, and he was listening patiently. They soon disappeared in the growing darkness, but Jim remained, white from head to foot. He had the sea at his feet, and the opportunity by his side, still hidden from him. What do you think, my friends? Was it still hidden? For me, that white figure in the stillness of coast and sea seemed to stand at the heart of a great mystery, catching all the light left in a darkened world. And then, suddenly, I lost him. 8. The end of the story. With these words Marlowe finished speaking, and the men around him got up from their armchairs. They did not seem to want to discuss the story, although it was incomplete. And only one of these listeners ever heard the last word of the story. It came to him more than 2 years later, in a thick packet containing many pages of writing. He had returned to dark, rainy England, and knew he would never go back to the East. But the packet made him think of distant seas under a bright, hot sun, and faces and voices from the past. He opened Marlowe's letter to him and began to read. I don't suppose you've forgotten Jim. You alone have shown interest in him, although you did not agree that he was in control of his fate. Well, you must judge for yourself now. Here is Jim's last message to the world, a greyish piece of paper, on which he wrote simply, "An awful thing has happened," and then, "I must now at once." Nothing more. I imagine he could not describe the true horror of what he saw. I can understand that. I also send you an old letter, which was found carefully put away in his desk. It is from his father, and Jim probably received it a few days before joining the Patna. The good old vicar writes 4 pages of fatherly advice and family news. The mother and daughters send all their love to their sailor son and brother. Jim never answered it, but he kept it lovingly all those years. Who knows what conversations his suffering soul had with those clear-eyed, ghostly figures living their peaceful lives in that quiet corner of the world. And in the rest of this letter I will tell you the end of Jim's story. It is a real adventure, romantic beyond the wildest dreams of his boyhood, but with an ending that seems in some way unavoidable. Something like this had to happen. I have found out almost all the details, but I wonder how Jim himself would tell the story. It is hard for me to believe that I shall never hear his voice again, or see his fresh, young, excited face. About a year ago, I arrived at Samarang and went to visit Stein as usual. I was surprised and pleased to see Tamitam, Jim's servant, at Stein's house, and hoped that perhaps Jim had come on a visit. But as soon as I met Stein, I realized something was wrong. The old man was looking miserable. "Come and see the girl," he said sadly. "They arrived 2 days ago. It's terrible, terrible. You must talk to her. Make her forgive him. Young hearts do not forgive easily." Refusing to say any more, he absolutely pushed me through a door. I found myself in a large, cool room. The girl was sitting at a long table, resting her head on her arms. She opened her eyes and recognized me at once. I felt cold to the bone as I looked at her hard, sad face and her black, staring eyes. "He has left me," she said quietly. "I wanted to die with him, but he refused. Ah, you men are unfaithful. What makes you so bad? I shall never cry for him, not one tear. He could see my face, hear my voice, and he still went away from me, driven by some evil thing he had heard or seen in his sleep." I was bitterly disappointed. "You must forgive him," I said. "We all want forgiveness." My voice sounded strange to me. Her frozen face did not change, and she made no sign as I left the room. I was glad to escape, and went to find Tamitam, who told me as much of the story as he knew. It all began with a man called Captain Brown, one of the most evil seamen in the Western Pacific. From Cape York to Eden Bay, he was famous for cheating, robbing, and murdering. He was a cruel, violent, and proud man with no idea of duty, conscience, or honour. At this moment in his life he was also desperate, because he had not earned much from his recent adventures, and his men were hungry and tired. They had stolen a Spanish ship, and were sailing it across the Java Sea towards the Indian Ocean, when suddenly Brown realized that Patusan would be a good place to get food and water. Perhaps he had heard of it as a largish village up the river, or perhaps it was just a name on his map. Anyway, they left their ship at the mouth of the river and took the ship's boat up to the trading post. However, the headman of the fishing village at Bateau Kring had managed to warn the Paterson people, who started firing their guns as soon as Brown's boat appeared. Brown angrily ordered his men to fire back. He had not been expecting a fight. He noticed the creek, which Jim had jumped over in his escape from the Rajah's men, and told his men to row into it. They landed and climbed a small hill, which gave them a good view of the village and the Rajah's stockade. They cut down some trees to make their own stockade and waited for the natives to attack in the growing darkness. The people of Patusan were frightened and confused. Their white lord was away in another part of the country, so it was Dane Waris who had ordered the shooting. Women and children left their homes and crowded into Jim's house, where Jewel was in control. She also kept the ammunition while Jim was absent. Doruman, his son, Jewel, the Rajah's advisor Kasim, and all the local chiefs and headmen met in Jim's house to decide what to do. Jewel and Dane Waris wanted to drive away the white men, but Doruman only seemed interested in keeping his son safe. Kasim was playing a clever game, hoping that these white men would attack and defeat Doruman's men before Jim returned. Meanwhile, he smiled and listened, pretending to offer the Rajah's help against the white men. Part of Kasim's plan involved Cornelius, because he spoke English. So the next day Kasim and Cornelius went to talk to Brown in his stockade. Brown listened to these offers of help and began to feel more hopeful. He had come to Patusan just to steal food, but perhaps here was an opportunity for him. Perhaps he could take control of Patusan and make himself a rich man. He would work with this white man they called Tuan Jim, for a while anyway, until it became necessary to kill him. This indeed was Cornelius's advice. "You must kill him as soon as you can," he said repeatedly. "Then you can have everything." While this was happening, Dane Waris's canoes went silently down to an island at the mouth of the river. This was on Doruman's orders in order to cut off Brown's escape route back to his ship, but also, I suspect, to keep his son out of harm's way. Kasim sent food to Brown and his men, but did not tell them about the canoes. Later that day, Brown saw from his stockade one of the villagers walking out of a house. He gave an order to one of his men, who fired a single shot. The native fell to the ground, dead. "That's right," cried Brown delightedly. "Put the fear of sudden death in them." Darkness fell, and soon one of the white men decided to go back to the boat to get his pipe. When he reached the creek, there was a bang, and he cried out in pain. "I've been hit!" Brown and the others listened to him dying slowly in the mud for several hours. They knew they could not help him. At last it was morning, and Brown saw a group of Malays coming towards the creek, with a tall white man in the middle of them. Jim had returned to Patusan during the night, to the great happiness of the villagers, and was coming to talk to Brown. "He'll come and order you to leave his people alone," Cornelius had told Brown. Soon Jim left the villagers behind and came on alone. Brown went down to the creek to meet him. He knew at once that he and Jim would never understand each other. Jim's clean white clothes, his honest eyes and confident look made Brown hate him immediately. They spoke to each other, two men completely opposite in character, separated only by a muddy creek. Most of the time Jim listened, while Brown talked, choosing his words carefully. He knew nothing of Jim's past, but he was extremely clever at finding the weakest place in a man's soul, and, by an evil chance, he found his way to Jim's. "You can't blame me for shooting that native last night," he cried. "If you have to save your own life in the dark, you don't care how many other people die, do you? I know I've done wrong in the past, but what about you? Why did you come and bury yourself here? You're no better than I am. Don't be a coward. There are 200 of you to every one of us. Either come and fight us, or let us go." Jim's face was like thunder. Finally, after a long silence, he replied, "Well, if you promise to leave the coast, we will let you go, and not fire on you unless you fire first." He turned away. The conversation was at an end, and Jim went back to the village to speak to Doramin and the headman. Some of them were doubtful about allowing the white men to leave. "They are cruel, evil robbers who have killed one of us," they cried. "We should kill them." But Jim said gently, "They have done evil things, certainly, but fortune has not been kind to them. Men can act badly sometimes, and still not be completely evil. It is best to let them go on with their lives." He paused, then went on, "Have I ever given you bad advice? Trust me, I'm ready to answer with my life for any harm that comes to you if the white men are allowed to go." All the headmen gave their opinion. Most of them simply said, "We believe Tuan Jim. We will do what he advises." And so it was agreed. Brown and his men were allowed to leave the hill, get into their boat, and row out of the creek into the river. That evening Jim sent Tam Itam down the river with a message for Dane Waris. "Tell him that his men must not fire at the whites when they leave. That is the agreement here." "It is an important message," said Tam Itam. "Give me a sign for Dane Waris, so that he knows these words come from you." Ever since Jim came to Patusan, he had worn Stein's silver ring. Everyone knew the ring, as it had been Doramin's present to Stein long ago. Jim now took it off his finger and gave it to Tam Itam as a sign for Dane Waris. The next morning Jim stood outside the Rajah's stockade, watching Brown and his men leave Patusan in a thick grey mist. But on board Brown's boat was the evil Cornelius, hiding under a sail. He was disappointed that Brown had not killed Jim, and he had decided to take his revenge in a different way. He had promised to show Brown another creek, which led to the small island further down the river, where Doramin's son and his men were waiting with their canoes. It was easy for Brown, who saw the chance to take revenge for his own misfortunes. Dane Waris and his men, with Tam Itam, were watching the bigger creek, and did not expect anyone to attack from the narrow creek behind them. When Brown's men fired their guns, several natives fell, including Dane Waris, who was shot through the head. The others ran away, screaming with fear. The white robbers were never seen again in Patusan, but it was known that their ship sank in the Indian Ocean a month later. Cornelius also died, because Tam Itam saw him on the island and realized what he had done. The narrow creek was impossible to find without help from someone who knew it. Cornelius tried to escape, but Tam Itam killed him with his knife. This done, Tam Itam hurried back to his canoe to take news of the disaster to his lord. At first Jim was angry. He wanted to chase the robbers, and began to give orders about collecting men and boats. But Tam Itam hesitated. "Forgive me, Tuan," he said, ashamed, "but it is not safe for me, your servant, to go among the people." Then Jim understood the awful truth. He had run away from one world, and now his new world, the one he had made with his own hands, was falling around him. He sat silently like a stone figure, while Tammy-Tan talked of fighting and the girl talked of danger. Who can tell what thoughts passed through his head? I think it was then that he tried to write to somebody and could not finish the message. Loneliness was closing on him. People had trusted him with their lives, but they would never be able to understand him. Meanwhile, in the village there was great sadness and anger as the body of the chief's son was brought home by canoe. Doramin looked at his dead son and slowly, very slowly, took Jim's silver ring off the cold, stiff hand. The crowd cried out in horror when they saw that well-known ring. And Doramin suddenly let out a great violent shout deep from the chest, like a wounded animal, a cry of pain and anger. Then there was silence. At about this time Jim left his house and started walking towards the river. "Time to finish this," he said. The girl followed him, calling out, "Won't you fight?" "There is nothing to fight for," he replied. "Won't you escape?" she cried again. "There is no escape," he said. "So you are leaving? Don't you remember you promised you would never leave me?" "Enough, poor girl," he answered. "If I stayed, I would not be worth having." She ran to him and, crying bitterly, held him in her arms. "I shall hold you like this. You are mine." Jim pulled himself away, looked into her face for a long moment, then ran to the water's edge. He jumped into a canoe with Tammy-Tam, and as they moved away, the girl screamed, "You are unfaithful!" "Forgive me," he cried. "Never!" she called back. "Never!" When Jim arrived at Doramin's stockade, the crowd of crying, confused people separated, respectfully and fearfully, to allow him to enter. He walked slowly through them, right up to the old chief, who was sitting in his usual chair, with the gun on his knees. Doramin's wife was bending miserably over her son's body, which was covered with the sheet. Jim lifted the sheet to look at his dead friend, then dropped it without a word. He waited for a moment, then said gently, "I am responsible. I come in sadness, with no weapon. I am ready." The heavy old man was helped up from his chair, and the silver ring, which Jim had worn so proudly, fell to the floor. With an expression of mad pain and anger on his face, Doramin stared at Jim standing stiffly in front of him. Then, looking him straight in the eyes, he lifted his gun and shot his son's friend through the chest. Jim looked proudly and bravely round at all the staring faces. Then, with a hand over his lips, he fell forward, dead. And that's the end. He disappears under a cloud, mysterious, forgotten, and much too romantic. Perhaps in that last short moment he saw the face of his opportunity, waiting for him like an Eastern bride. He left the arms of a living woman who loved him to marry the shadowy ghost of imagined honour and duty. Is he completely happy now? I wonder. We ought to know. He is one of us. Was I so very wrong after all to believe in him? Who knows? He is gone, and the poor girl is living a soundless, frozen life in Stein's house. Stein looks much older now, and is feeling his age. He often says he is preparing to leave all this, while he waves his hand sadly at his butterflies.